welcome to Let's Read. Today we're going to read Fully Automated Luxury Communism by Bastani, Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Great Disorder. In the summer of 1989, as it became clear the United States and its allies had won the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama wrote an essay titled The End of History for the national interest. Its core proposition was provocative yet simple, with the little-known academic asserting that the collapse of the Soviet Union was of greater importance than simply marking the end of a military rivalry. Quote, "What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is, the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as a final form of human government." End quote. Fukuyama's contention was that, while clocks would still tick and years continue to roll by, no new ideas would emerge, at least none capable of challenging the status quo. In making this extraordinary claim, he referenced the unlikely authorities of Karl Marx and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. In their different ways, both had claimed that history had a final destination. Now, with the end of the Cold War, they were proven right. Only rather than the Prussian state or the downfall of capitalism, the twilight of ideology was Big Macs and Coca-Cola. Fukuyama swiftly became an intellectual superstar, turning the essay into his first book, The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992. There he offered an extended explanation of his core hypothesis from 3 years earlier, outlining how history is primarily driven by ideas constantly competing with one another. As a result, by the 1900s, liberal democracy, and by extension market capitalism, reigned supreme because no viable alternative remained. While in a sense that was true, the USSR had just disintegrated, it failed to grasp how the gravest challenges are more likely to emerge from internal contradiction or external, unanticipated shock than an absence of content. For Fukuyama, the end of history signalled a world defined by economic calculation and, quote, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands, end quote. And yet, the present moment, defined by challenges such as rising temperatures, technological unemployment, income inequality, and societal aging, to name a few, poses questions which extend beyond mere technical competence. If Fukuyama's words were naive in 1992, then in the decade that followed the financial crisis of 2008, they became positively ridiculous. Indeed, he admitted as much in a book he published on identity in 2018. But the stakes are greater than simply being right or wrong on an issue of academic detail. Because worse than naive credulity or mistaking a brief moment for historical permanence, many in power still view Fukuyama's hypothesis as sacrosanct. 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, the legacy of his work is a political common sense that actively obstructs us from addressing the great challenges we face. After all, why would decisive action, particularly if it undermined the interests of business and profit, be necessary if nothing really changes? Fukuyama's triumphalist thinking a generation ago, even if he himself has now renounced it somewhat, still matters. That is because it has since gone on to infuse a broader folk politics that understood the end of the Cold War to not only signify the supremacy of market capitalism, but also the inevitable demise of self-governing nation-states. In this flat, crowded and connected world, everything would be subject to an ever-accelerating change. Everything, that is, except the rules of the game. Indeed, many no longer even considered them to be rules, but rather reality itself, with alternative political systems viewed as either futile or incomprehensible. Here, liberal capitalism went from a contingent project to a reality principle. Welcome to the world of capitalist realism, where the map is the territory and nothing really matters. Capitalist realism. Capitalist realism is best summed up with a single sentence. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. For Mark Fisher, the British theorist who coined the term, that catchphrase captures the very essence of our era, with capitalism not only viewed as the exclusively viable political and economic system, but also one where it is impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative. After all, how can you contrive an alternative to reality itself? Turning to the 2006 film Children of Men, Fisher investigates its surreal normality as a dystopia fit for our age, with the world it projects more like an extrapolation or exacerbation of ours, rather than an alternative to it. In its world, as in ours, ultra-authoritarianism and capital are by no means incompatible. Internment camps and franchise coffee bars coexist. This tallies with the thinking of Elaine Badiou, who writes, "We live in a contradiction, where all existence is presented to us as ideal. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful. So instead, they have decided to say that all the rest is horrible. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic." Because capitalist realism has no offer of a better future, especially so over the course of the last decade, its default logic is one of anti-utopianism. Flat wages, falling home ownership, and a warming planet might be bad, granted, but at least we have iPhones. And yes, you may not be able to access the things your parents took for granted, like affordable homes or free higher education, but you should still be grateful. At least it's not the 16th century. Over time, this argument, seductive for the opening years of the 21st century, is being revealed as patently absurd. Capitalist realism, a world where nothing really changes, is giving way to a historic moment defined by crisis. One where, unless we transform our understanding of the future once more, the very worst demons of centuries past will prevail. It's unleashed. To say the present era is one of crisis borders on cliché. Habitual and familiar, this crisis differs from the dystopias of George Orwell or Aldous Huxley, or hell in the paintings of Bosch, or the last days of Earth as told in the Book of Revelations. It is unlike Europe during the Black Death, or Central Asia as it faced the galloping horde. Here, instead, we inhabit a world in freefall, and yet we are all along for the ride. Some aspects of this, like the European migration crisis, are highly mediatized and public. Here, people displaced by war and social breakdown migrate, often meeting with hostility in response. While for previous generations the Berlin Wall was totemic of division, only 235 people died trying to cross it. Compare that to the 3,770 souls who died or went missing in the Mediterranean trying to reach the shores of Europe just in 2015. And if, as an undocumented migrant, you are fortunate enough to safely cross the Mediterranean or the US-Mexico border, or the fences and forests between Hungary and Bulgaria, your problems are only just beginning. There are, of course, other expressions of our broken world that are equally profound, if less immediately obvious. One is a crisis of mental health, with suicide the leading killer of British men under the age of 50 and depression expected to be the leading cause of the global burden of disease by 2030. Others still are less easy to personalise, remaining incomprehensible on a human scale. One is a crisis of the state, as agency ebbs to the market and an increasingly globalised economy undermines the ability of nations to act decisively. This process of market and capital integration, where commodities move more seamlessly than ever, is entirely at odds with the experience of displaced peoples and undocumented migrants as they face walls, surveillance, and ever more securitized borders. As the state gives way to the market, this is accompanied by a nebulous sense of loss, as the crisis of representation empties democratic institutions of authority and citizens come to view them as little more than conduits for the interests of corrupt elites. This entrenches the tendencies of globalization as previous, if imperfect, repositories of accountability. National governments lose the consent of those they represent. In the supposedly good times, something had gone badly wrong, but it remained an undercurrent. 2008. Return of history. Almost 2 decades after Fukuyama's false prophecy that decisively changed, a banking crisis, a debt crisis, a deficit crisis, all culminating in the imposition of austerity from Greece to California. Alongside that was war in Georgia, the flowering of the Arab Spring, uprising in the Ukraine, insurrection, and then the most bloody of civil wars in Syria. Elsewhere, previously low-intensity conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan deteriorated further, soon joined by similarly hazy struggles in Libya and Yemen. In early 2014, the Russian Federation added new territory for the first time as it annexed Crimea following a local referendum. A few months later, straddling Syria and Iraq in an area the size of the United Kingdom, insurgents declared a caliphate, the Islamic State. But even amid all this, it was events in Western Europe, a heartland of capitalist realism, which proved most surprising. A heightened cycle of protest and riot in England after 2010 was followed by a failed but surprisingly close referendum on Scottish independence 4 years later. Even that paled into insignificance, however, when, in 2016, Britain voted to leave the European Union, becoming the first member state in its history to do so. While Brexit was the most important political moment in Europe for a generation, it was soon outdone by events across the Atlantic when, just a few months later, Donald Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States. Less than a decade after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2008, it was now undeniable. An expansionist Russia, isolationist Britain, and broken economic model had all been outdone by a reality TV star becoming the most powerful person on earth. History was back. Trump's inauguration speech the following February stood in defiant contrast to the heady rhetoric of his predecessor, Barack Obama, when he assumed office 8 years earlier. Claiming that the system was failing ordinary Americans, Trump's explicit message of social decay and aggrieved nationalism became his immediate signature in office. And yet, in a strange way, despite their markedly different forms of presentation, Obama and Trump shared a similar faith in the unique ability of markets to find solutions. After all, anything else is tantamount to heresy in a world of capitalist realism, where the end of the world is more plausible than the end of capitalism. This condition presents arguably the most pressing crisis of all, an absence of collective imagination. It is as if all humanity has been afflicted by a psychological complex, capitalist realism making us believe the present world is stronger than our capacity to remake it, as if it were not our ancestors who created what stands before us now. As if the very essence of humanity, if there is such a thing, is not to constantly build new worlds. In its defence, capitalism can point to an impressive record, at least so far. Having faced crises almost every decade for 2 centuries amid the ferocious pace of constantly accelerating change, it has always found ways of extracting profit and, eventually, improving living standards. Capitalism has survived, evolved, and prospered through the Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, protectionism, 2 world wars, the end of the gold standard, and the demise of the Bretton Woods Agreement. Little more than a generation ago, much of the world was under the political influence of the former Soviet Union, with it and the United States seemingly destined to face off in nuclear confrontation. And yet that never came to pass, and, as Fukuyama would later write, a divided world was replaced by one where markets prevailed and liberal democracy would reign supreme. This explains why, in spite of manifest crises, those who champion the status quo are as confident as they are. Ours may well be a world of low growth, declining living standards and rising geopolitical tensions, but capitalism's staunchest advocates draw strength from knowing similar problems have been dealt with before. But beside those issues are challenges seemingly harder to overcome. In isolation, each is historically significant, yet taken together they can be viewed as threats whole-scale. It's civilizational, holding the potential to undermine the ability of capitalism to reproduce itself as a system based on infinite growth, production for profit, and wage labour. There are 5 such crises, which at times overlap. They are climate change and the consequences of global warming, resource scarcity, particularly for energy, minerals and fresh water, societal ageing, as life expectancy increases and birth rates concurrently fall, a growing surplus of global poor who form an ever larger unnecessariat, and, perhaps most critically, a new machine age which will herald ever greater technological unemployment, as progressively more physical and cognitive labour is performed by machines rather than humans. Confronting such crises is the basis of FALC. Capitalism, at least as we know it, is about to end. What matters is what comes next. The claim that capitalism will end is, for capitalist realism, like saying a triangle doesn't have 3 sides, or that the law of gravity no longer applies while an apple falls from a tree. Rather than understanding the present as one historical period among many, like Victorian England or the Roman Republic, to be alive at the end of history means presuming our social systems to be as unchanging as the physical laws that govern the universe. And yet the truth is capitalist realism is already coming apart. The fact you are reading these words at all is proof. Despite the observations of Francis Fukuyama and his disciples, history returned on the 15th of September 2008 when the global financial system crashed. Within weeks, the world's leading economic powers, previous zealots for minimal state interference, were left with no alternative but to bail out their domestic banks, with some even being nationalised. That exposed their previous free market fervour for the lie it was. This was socialism for the rich and market capitalism for the rest. The critics had always said as much. Now nobody could deny it. But as well as revealing what had passed as common sense for the political project it was, that moment also ended a phase of global expansion that had powered financial services and real estate, most notably in Britain and the United States, to the forefront of economic life. Over the preceding 2 decades, it was these areas which had underpinned growth, tax receipts and forms of asset ownership which were at least moderately distributed. After 2008, that decisively changed, meaning that in many countries poverty has increased, wages have stagnated, and growth, in any significant sense, has vanished. In the US, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, popularly known as food stamps, is a federal initiative that helps low-income Americans buy food. By virtue of its objective, it is one of the most accurate indicators of poverty in the country. While in 2007, immediately before the crisis, 26 million Americans were in receipt of food stamps. By 2012, at the tail end of what some now call the Great Recession, that figure had almost doubled to 46 million. Over subsequent years, despite an alleged upturn in the country's economic fortunes, that number barely moved, with Donald Trump frequently highlighting how 43 million Americans used food stamps while on the campaign trail in 2016. For all the talk of his victory being powered by fake news, that number was entirely accurate. Analogous to food stamp use in the US is a meteoric rise in the number of people using food banks in Britain. The Trussell Trust, which operates the largest food bank network in the country, claims to have delivered around 41,000 food packs in 2010. By 2017, that had risen to 1.2 million after 9 consecutive years of rising demand for their services. While the increased use of food banks in the UK is partially the result of disastrous welfare reforms, it also reflects something observable on both sides of the Atlantic. Being in work no longer guarantees escaping poverty, quite the opposite. The most detailed data available in the UK only serves to confirm a historic shift has taken place over the last decade, with those in relative poverty more likely to be in a working household than not. Most troubling of all is that this is accelerating. By the end of 2016, 55% of people in poverty were in a household where someone was employed. An astonishing 7.4 million people. Just 6 months later, that figure had risen to 60%. Powering this downward spiral is falling wages. Since 2008, real pay in Britain, which takes inflation into account, has dropped by more than 10%. It should come as little surprise, then, that nearly 17 million Brits of working age have less than £100 in personal savings. In the United States, it's a similar story, with 63% of Americans saying that they have $500 or less put aside. The other pillar of consent for 20th century capitalism, of property ownership as a complement to democracy, is in similar retreat. In Britain, where the conservative Noel Skeleton coined the term property-owning democracy in 1923, home ownership is at its lowest level since 1985 and continues to fall. It's even worse in the US, though, where a combination of high prices, low wages, and little credit means the average American is less likely to own their own home than at any time since 1965, 4 years before the moon landing. Inertia. While ordinary people are struggling, measured through the use of food banks and food stamps, wages which buy less, or unmet expectations regarding home ownership, the abstract vision of the economy peddled by elites, defined by growth and productivity, is in similar disarray. After all, on output per hour worked, perhaps the most useful measure of economic progress, Britain produced less in 2017 than it did a decade earlier. Such a development is without precedent in modern history. Similar issues are in evidence elsewhere around the world. Lost decade, previously used to describe anomalous economic conditions in countries like Italy and Japan, is increasingly applied to an ever-growing cluster of nations. Since the crisis of 2008, Greece and Spain have seen unemployment go beyond 25%, with youth unemployment touching double that. Elsewhere, economies such as Hungary, Austria, Portugal, and Latvia's are no bigger now than they were in 2008 when measured on an output per person basis. Even in the rising nations of the global south, the trend is clear. The 10% growth which characterized the Chinese and Indian economies during the early years of the 21st century are now a thing of the past. Elsewhere, the likes of Brazil and Russia have been mired in recession almost as severe as parts of Europe, the only difference being their economic malaise has kicked in at far lower levels of relative development. Such a shift has only served to strengthen the forces of autocracy. So our world is one increasingly defined by low growth, low productivity, and low wages. Before the crisis, most policymakers would have thought such events impossible, let alone speculated about an appropriate response. Alan Greenspan's 2008 remarks to the US House of Representatives are illustrative. The banking crisis having left this former chairman of the Federal Reserve in a state of shocked disbelief and distressed by events he previously viewed as impossible. While neoliberalism, which emerged with the Thatcher and Reagan governments, led to higher unemployment and lower wage growth for more than a generation, this was mitigated by access to cheaper goods and services, by relocating production to countries with lower wages, as well as inflated asset prices, particularly housing, and access to cheap mortgage and consumer debt. As well as forming the foundation for a widely felt material improvement in living standards, this was the economic base for a world where there was no alternative. How could you really be angry at anything with your credit cards and ever cheaper consumer gadgets? And even if you were, what choice did you have once you'd earned your stake in the system with a home of your own? Now, with these previous fixtures in retreat, elites have yet to make a positive offer about what comes next. What we know for certain is that the status quo can't hold. There is no consent for a system which, on nearly every measure, is going backwards. This all explains the revival of radical politics on both the left and the right in recent years. Because the events of 2008 came as such a shock, even for the system's outsiders, nobody proved immediately able to take advantage of such a historic opportunity. Gradually that would change, however, with the previously unthinkable becoming increasingly commonplace. In the 2009 European parliamentary elections, the far right made impressive gains across the continent, with the likes of UKIP, France's National Front, and even the British National Party attracting widespread support. The BNP's results in particular came as a shock, with a party historically connected to the country's neo-Nazi movement gaining almost 1 million votes and 2 MEPs. For a few years, similar energies on the left were limited to the streets, such as the 2010 British student movement and the Spanish Indignados, but eventually these too translated into success at the ballot box. Spain offered the most obvious initial expression of that with the emergence of a new party, Podemos, which gained 5 MEPs in 2014, just a few months after it had been formed, before finishing third in the following year's Spanish general election. But before then, in January 2015, Greece's Syriza, a coalition of previously insignificant left-wing groups, would win the most seats in that country's general election. After agreeing to be the senior partner in a wider coalition, they formed a government, becoming the first party of the radical left to do so in a Western democracy since the Second World War. This fed hopes of a deal between Greece and the Troika of the European Commission, European Central Bank and the International Monetary Fund on the terms of their coming bailout deal that summer. In due course, Syriza campaigned for an Oxy vote, defying the conditions proposed by the Troika. To widespread amazement, Oxy, no in Greek, won by a landslide. While the Troika would refuse to change their stance in the negotiations that followed, and the Greek government capitulated to their terms, a new reality had emerged. The corridors of power were no longer insulated from mass protests in the street. In Britain, meanwhile, the Conservative Party won its first majority since 1992, as the right-wing UKIP attracted almost 4 million votes, and the Scottish National Party took an astonishing 40 seats from Labour in Scotland. A few months later, Jeremy Corbyn, who began his outsider bid at odds of 200 to 1, became leader of the Labour Party. His supporters certain he could be powered by the same wave that had taken the likes of Syriza and Podemos so far in such a short space of time. It was 2016 which proved to be the decisive year, however, as a crisis that started 8 years earlier found its most potent political expressions. In June, Britain voted to leave the European Union, with more people voting in the Brexit referendum than any previous vote held in the country. That appeared to be a pivotal moment, with right-wing populism seeming to capture an increasingly clear hostility to governing elites. As Nigel Farage, a figurehead for the Brexit movement, triumphantly declared on that night, "This is a victory for ordinary people, for good people, for decent people, the people who've had enough of the merchant bankers." Yet even the shock of Brexit paled in comparison to events just a few months later, when Donald Trump, a well-known businessman and reality TV star, was elected President of the United States. Winning the Republican primary earlier that year had already caused a shock, and with Bernie Sanders pushing Hillary Clinton close for the Democratic nomination, the signs were there for an upset. Which was precisely what ensued as Trump took part previously held Democratic Rust Belt states on his way to the White House. The President-elect's victory speech was reminiscent of Farage's, as he told the forgotten men and women of the country that they would be forgotten no longer. The following April, buoyed by the perception of a zeitgeist seemingly to her advantage, Britain's new Prime Minister Theresa May called a general election to cement her party's grip on power. An enhanced majority was widely viewed as inevitable, the question being how big a landslide the Conservatives could achieve. And yet, in a manner analogous to both Trump and Brexit, Labour defied the odds, with a clear message of a break with the status quo. While they didn't form a government, they did deprive the Tories of a majority, winning an additional 3.5 million votes in the process, and enjoying the biggest increase in vote share for any party since 1945. The Tories, significantly to the right of their campaigns in recent years, also did well, winning their highest share of the vote since 1987. Britain now displayed both key features of the new political landscape: massively increased polarisation and uncertainty as to whether the politics of the left or right would ultimately prevail. While they might not share much politically, Trump and Corbyn, along with Brexit and the emergence of Podemos, Bernie Sanders and Syriza, indicate the era of capitalist realism is over. And yet there is also a deeper story at play, one which remains largely unremarked upon. While the events of the last several years are both historic and unexpected, they are a response to an economic crisis beginning in 2008, which itself only represents the first stage of a prolonged period of global disorder. Over coming decades, we will not only endure the aftershocks of the failure of this economic model to deliver rising living standards, but also the era-defining effects of the aforementioned 5 crises. Individually, each poses an existential threat to our way of life. Together, they could blow away the social and economic certainties of the last 2.5 centuries. But there is a deeper layer still, because we are at a crossroads as much as a cliff edge. Alongside these challenges, we also see the contours of something new, a society as distinct from our own as that of the 20th century to feudalism, or urban civilization from the life of the hunter-gatherer. It builds on technologies whose development has been accelerating for decades, which, only now, are set to undermine the key features of everything we had previously presumed to be as unchanging as scarcity itself. Its name? Fully automated luxury communism.